Cowboys Final Claim. When Nona Winnie Hollister had accepted her fate a marriage she didn't want. But just before she could say her vows, Rhett Carter burst into the church, his revolver gleaming under candlelight. He caught her wrist, his grip unrelenting. "You were never meant for him, Winnie," he murmured. "And I'll be damned if I let you go now." Chapter 1. The Unwilling Bride's Dawn. The Arizona sun, a molten orb of fire, was just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in hues of apricot and rose. When Nona Winnie Hollister stared out the dusty window of her childhood bedroom, the familiar landscape of her family's sprawling ranch stretching out before her, a bittersweet ache in her chest.
Today was the day.
The day she would become Mrs. Silas Blackwood, a union orchestrated not by love, but by necessity, a desperate attempt to save the Hollister ranch from the brink of financial ruin. Winnie traced the delicate lace of the wedding gown draped across the worn cedar chest, a gown that felt more like a shroud than a symbol of joyous union. It was beautiful, undeniably so, with its intricate beadwork and flowing train, but it represented everything she was losing: her freedom, her dreams, the faint hope that she might one day marry for love, not obligation. She was 57, her youth long faded, but the embers of a rebellious spirit still flickered within her. She'd lived a life of quiet resilience, weathering the loss of her parents, the harsh realities of ranch life, and the slow, creeping despair of loneliness. Silas, a man 20 years her senior, was a powerful, wealthy rancher, but his eyes held a coldness that chilled her to the bone. She ran a hand through her silver-streaked auburn hair, the strands still holding a hint of the fiery red of her youth. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a woman etched with the lines of time and hardship, but her eyes, a startling shade of turquoise, still held a spark of defiance. She wouldn't weep. She wouldn't break. Hollister women were made of sterner stuff. A knock on the door startled her. Her younger brother, Samuel, his face creased with worry, entered the room. He was all she had left, and the thought of leaving him, of entrusting the ranch to his inexperienced hands, weighed heavily on her heart. "Winnie," he began, his voice strained. Are you ready?" She forced a smile, a fragile mask to hide her turmoil. "As ready as I'll ever be, Samuel. It's just a wedding, after all. A business transaction, really." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. He knew the sacrifice she was making, the silent anguish she bore. He'd tried to dissuade her, to find another way, but the debts were too steep, the creditors too relentless. Silas Blackwood was their only hope. "He doesn't deserve you, Winnie," Samuel said, his voice thick with emotion. "You deserve happiness." Winnie placed a comforting hand on his arm. "Happiness is a luxury we can't afford, Samuel. We have the ranch to think of, our family's legacy. This is the only way." She picked up a small, tarnished silver locket, a cherished heirloom passed down from her mother. Inside was a faded photograph of her parents, their faces young and full of hope. She clutched it tightly, drawing strength from their memory, from the unspoken promise she'd made to protect the land they'd loved so dearly. The hours passed in a blur of preparations. The small, weathered church in town was adorned with simple wildflowers, a stark contrast to the opulent affair Silas had initially proposed. Winnie had insisted on a quiet ceremony, a small gathering of family and close friends. She wanted no spectacle, no grand display of a union built on desperation. As she stood before the altar, the scent of beeswax and dust filling the air, Silas's hard, possessive gaze met hers. He offered a curt nod, a gesture devoid of warmth or affection. The preacher, a thin, nervous man, began the ceremony, his voice droning on about duty and obligation. Winnie felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach, a sense of suffocating inevitability closing in on her. She focused on the stained glass window depicting a scene of the Virgin Mary, her serene face a beacon of hope in the dim light. Winnie searched for a similar serenity within herself, but found only a growing sense of unease. The preacher's words seemed to echo in the sudden silence, a silence shattered by the creak of the church doors swinging open with a resounding bang. A figure stood silhouetted against the harsh sunlight, a figure tall and imposing, his presence radiating an aura of danger and defiance. The light shifted, revealing a face etched with hard lines, a face that sent a jolt of both fear and something else, something indefinable, through Winnie's very core. It was Rhett Carter, a man she hadn't seen in years, a man whose name was whispered in hushed tones, a man known for his recklessness, his disregard for the law, and his unwavering loyalty to those he considered his own. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, locked onto hers, and a gasp rippled through the small congregation. A revolver gleamed, catching the light of the candles that had been lit for the wedding, held loosely at his side. He took a step forward, his boots echoing on the worn wooden floor. Another. Then he was before her, close enough for his ragged breath to stir the fine hairs on her arm. He took her wrist in hand, the leather of his glove rough, but his touch holding a tenderness that Silas had never possessed. He spoke, his voice rough, low, sending shivers up and down her spine, echoing out for all in the church to hear. "You were never meant for him, Winnie," he murmured, the words a raw, possessive claim. "And I'll be damned if I let you go now." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The preacher stammered, Silas sputtered in outraged disbelief, and Samuel moved as if to intervene, but Rhett's gaze, sharp and unwavering, held him at bay. Winnie, caught in the vortex of this sudden, unexpected upheaval, felt a surge of something akin to relief. Chapter 2. Shadows in the Candlelight. The silence in the church was thick, heavy, broken only by the frantic whispers of the startled congregation and Silas's sputtering, indignant protests. "Carter, you dare interrupt this sacred ceremony? This is an outrage." Rhett ignored him, his gaze fixed solely on Winnie. His eyes, usually so guarded, held a vulnerability that she'd never seen before, a flicker of something that mirrored the turmoil raging within her own heart. His grip on her wrist, though firm, wasn't painful. It was a claim, a possessive gesture that sent a strange tremor through her. "Winnie," he repeated, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards of the church. "Come with me." It wasn't a question. It was a demand, a plea, and a promise all wrapped into one. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time in years. The lines around his eyes were deeper, etched by sun and hardship, but the intensity of his gaze was unchanged. He was a man weathered by the frontier, a man who lived by his own code, a man who had always been a shadow on the periphery of her life. She remembered him as a boy, wild and untamed, the son of a neighboring rancher whose land had been swallowed up by her father's ambition, a source of lingering guilt that she'd carried for years. He'd been a constant presence, a thorn in her side, a challenge to her carefully constructed world of rules and obligations. Then, he'd vanished, disappearing into the vastness of the Arizona territory, leaving behind only whispers of outlaw deeds and a reputation that preceded him like a gathering storm. Now he was back, standing before her, disrupting the carefully orchestrated plan that was supposed to save her family, offering her an escape she hadn't dared to dream of. But escape to what? To a life of uncertainty, of danger, of running from the law. Silas, his face contorted with rage, finally found his voice. Sheriff Buckley, arrest this man." The sheriff, a portly man with a handlebar mustache and a perpetually weary expression, shuffled forward, his hand hovering hesitantly over his own revolver. He clearly wasn't eager to confront Rhett Carter, a man whose reputation for swift and decisive action was well known throughout the territory. "Carter," Buckley began, his voice lacking conviction, you're disturbing the peace. I suggest you leave." Rhett chuckled, a low, throaty sound that sent shivers down Winnie's spine. "The peace was already disturbed, Buckley. This marriage, it's a sham. A forced union built on lies and desperation." He turned his gaze back to Winnie, his eyes softening. "Winnie knows it. Don't you, Winnie?" The question hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation. She looked from Rhett's intense gaze to Silas's furious, possessive stare, then to Samuel's worried face. Her brother's eyes held a silent plea. Do what you must, Winnie. Save yourself. The locket, still clutched in her hand, felt heavy, a reminder of her duty, of her family's legacy. But the weight of that legacy had become unbearable, a crushing burden that threatened to suffocate her. She met Rhett's gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. The decision, when it came, was surprisingly clear. It wasn't a decision born of logic or reason, but of a deep, primal instinct, a yearning for something more than the suffocating life she'd been living. Yes, she whispered, the word barely audible, yet it seemed to echo through the silent church. It is. A collective gasp rose from the congregation. Silas's face turned a shade of purple that rivaled the richest velvet. Rhett's grip on her wrist tightened, a silent acknowledgement of her choice. He turned to the sheriff, his voice hardening. Buckley, you know me. I'm not looking for trouble. But I won't let this happen. I'm taking Winnie with me. He didn't wait for a response. He pulled her gently, but firmly, towards the open doors of the church, towards the blinding sunlight, towards the unknown. As they stepped out into the open, Winnie felt a gust of wind whip through her hair, carrying with it the scent of dust, sagebrush, and something else: freedom. Silas's enraged shouts followed them, a cacophony of threats and curses. You'll pay for this, Carter. You'll both pay. This isn't over. She's my wife. She belongs to me. Rhett didn't look back. He led her towards a magnificent black stallion tethered near the church, its coat gleaming in the sun, its eyes wild and untamed, a reflection of its rider. He helped her mount behind him, his hands strong and sure. As they rode away from the town, away from the church, away from the life she'd known, Winnie felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. She was riding into the unknown with an outlaw, a man who represented everything she'd been taught to fear. Yet, as she clung to him, feeling the warmth of his back against her chest, the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves beneath them, she felt a sense of liberation she hadn't experienced in years. The shadows of the candlelight were behind her. Ahead lay only the vast, open expanse of the Arizona Territory and the uncertain promise of a new dawn. The weight of what was to come was heavy on her shoulders. Chapter 3. A Renegade's Claim. The wind whipped at Winnie's face, stinging her eyes and tearing at the carefully arranged curls that had escaped her hastily pinned-up hair. She clung tighter to Rhett, her body pressed against his broad back, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat a reassuring counterpoint to the frantic gallop of the stallion. They rode hard, leaving the dusty town of Redemption far behind, the shouts of Silas and the posse he was undoubtedly assembling fading into the distance. Winnie had never ridden like this before, so recklessly, so freely. The familiar landscape of her childhood blurred into a streak of browns and greens, the mesas and canyons a dramatic backdrop to their desperate flight. She felt a strange sense of exhilaration, a release from the suffocating constraints of her former life, but it was mingled with a deep-seated fear. She had thrown her lot in with an outlaw, a man who lived outside the law, a man who could offer her no security, no guarantees. Rhett, sensing her apprehension, slowed the stallion to a more manageable pace. He didn't speak, but his presence was a comforting reassurance, a silent promise of protection. They rode in silence for a long while, the only sounds the rhythmic beat of the horse's hooves, the wind whistling through the canyons, and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the rugged terrain, Rhett finally spoke, his voice low and gruff. We'll make camp here for the night. He guided the stallion towards a secluded alcove, a natural shelter formed by a towering rock formation, partially hidden by a cluster of scrub oak and juniper trees. A small, spring-fed stream trickled nearby, its water a precious resource in this arid land. Winnie slid off the horse, her legs stiff and aching from the unaccustomed ride. She watched as Rhett efficiently unsaddled the stallion, his movements practiced and economical, the actions of a man who had spent his life on the open range. He was a stark contrast to Silas, whose hands were soft and uncalloused, whose world revolved around ledgers and land deeds, not survival and instinct. Rhett built a small fire, the flames flickering to life, casting dancing shadows on the rock walls. He offered her a strip of dried meat and a canteen of water, a meager meal, but Winnie ate it with a gratitude she hadn't felt for the elaborate feasts Silas had often provided. As they sat by the fire, the vast expanse of the star-studded sky above them, Winnie finally found her voice. "Why, Rhett? Why did you do it?" He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight, a mixture of shadows and intensity. "I told you. You weren't meant for him. You were meant for something more." "More?" she echoed, her voice tinged with both curiosity and apprehension. "More what? A life on the run? A constant fear of being caught?" He shrugged, a gesture that seemed to dismiss her concerns. "Maybe. Or maybe a life lived on your own terms. A life where you're not beholden to anyone but yourself." His words resonated with a longing she'd suppressed for years, a yearning for autonomy, for a life that was truly her own. But the reality of her situation was daunting. She was a woman of a certain age, with no skills, no resources, and now, no family to fall back on. "I don't know what to do," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. I've never been on my own like this." Rhett reached out and gently took her hand, his touch surprisingly tender. His calloused fingers brushed against hers, sending a jolt of warmth through her. "You're not alone, Winnie. I'm here." His words, simple yet profound, offered a flicker of hope in the darkness. But she couldn't ignore the questions that swirled in her mind. Why was he doing this? What did he want from her? Was it simply a desire to thwart Silas, to settle an old score? Or was there something more, something deeper, driving his actions? "What about your past?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "The things they say about you, the outlaw, the—" She stopped mid-sentence. He released a sigh, a sound heavy with unspoken burdens. "The past is the past, Winnie. I've done things I'm not proud of. But I'm not the man I used to be." His grip tightened. "I want to be the man you need me to be." His words were spoken in the growing dark, the flames casting dancing shadows on his face, obscuring his expression. But the sincerity in his voice was undeniable. A new chapter had begun, one written in uncertainty and maybe, just maybe, something akin to hope. A tear trickled down her cheek, reflecting the fire's dying light. She wasn't sure if it was from fear or a spark of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a very, very long time. Chapter 4. Across the barren plains. The next few days were a blur of relentless travel, a constant push across the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Arizona Territory. Rhett was a careful and experienced guide, navigating by the stars, the sun, and the subtle signs of the land. He knew the hidden trails, the watering holes, the places where they could find shelter from the scorching sun and the biting wind. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He was fiercely protective of Winnie, ensuring she had enough to eat and drink, shielding her from the harsh elements, and always keeping a watchful eye out for danger. Winnie, despite her initial apprehension, found herself adapting to the rigors of life on the trail. The physical hardship was demanding, but it was also strangely liberating. She was shedding the layers of her former life, the constraints of propriety and expectation, and discovering a strength she never knew she possessed. She learned to ride for hours without complaint, to sleep under the stars, to find solace in the silence of the desert. She also began to see a different side of Rhett, a side that went beyond the outlaw reputation. He was a man of quiet competence, of unwavering resolve, and of a surprising gentleness. He taught her how to track animals, how to identify edible plants, how to build a fire that wouldn't attract unwanted attention. He shared stories of his past, not the sensationalized tales of outlaw exploits, but the quiet, personal memories of his childhood, of his family, of the loss that had shaped his life. He spoke of his father, a proud, stubborn man who had refused to sell his land to the ever-expanding empire of the Hollister family, a refusal that had ultimately led to his ruin. He spoke of his mother, a gentle woman who had died of a broken heart, leaving him alone and adrift in a world that seemed determined to crush him. Winnie listened, her heart aching for the young boy he had been, for the pain he had endured. She began to understand the roots of his resentment, the source of his defiance. She also began to see the glimmer of goodness that still flickered beneath his hardened exterior, a goodness that drew her to him despite the danger he represented. One evening, as they sat by a crackling fire, sharing a meager meal of roasted rabbit, Winnie asked him about the scar that ran across his left cheek, a visible reminder of a violent past. He touched the scar self-consciously, his fingers tracing its jagged outline. "A souvenir from a disagreement," he said, his voice tight. "A reminder that some debts can never be fully repaid."
"Who was it?"
Winnie asked, her voice soft. "Who gave you that scar?" He hesitated, his eyes clouding with a mixture of anger and regret. "A man named Cruz," he finally said.
"He was a part of my past."
"A part I'd rather forget." Winnie sensed that there was more to the story, a deeper layer of pain and betrayal that he wasn't ready to share. She didn't press him. She understood the need for secrets, the weight of unspoken burdens. They all carried them, especially in this harsh, unforgiving land. As the days turned into weeks, a sense of camaraderie developed between them, a bond forged by shared hardship and mutual respect. They learned to rely on each other, to anticipate each other's needs, to find comfort in each other's presence. The initial fear that Winnie had felt began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of trust, and something that she was afraid to name, afraid to acknowledge, even to herself. The landscape began to change, the barren plains giving way to rolling hills and canyons, the vegetation becoming more lush, the air cooler. They were heading towards the mountains, towards a hidden sanctuary that Rhett knew, a place where they could rest, regroup, and decide what to do next. But even as they drew closer to their destination, Winnie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed, that Silas's relentless pursuit was still a threat. She saw shadows in the distance, heard whispers on the wind, felt the prickle of unease on her skin. One afternoon, as they were riding through a narrow canyon, Rhett suddenly reined in his horse, his body tense, his senses on high alert. "Someone's coming," he said, his voice low and urgent.
"Get down."
He pulled her off the horse and pushed her behind a large boulder, his hand hovering over his revolver. Winnie's heart pounded in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. The fear she thought she had conquered returned with a vengeance, a chilling reminder of the precariousness of their situation. The unknown was closing in, and she wasn't sure if either of them were ready. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Haunted Past. The sound of approaching horses grew louder, the rhythmic thud of hooves echoing through the narrow canyon. Rhett remained motionless, his body a coiled spring, his eyes scanning the terrain, his hand firmly gripping his revolver. Winnie, crouched behind the boulder, held her breath, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The riders appeared, a small group of men, their faces grim, their rifles held at the ready. Winnie recognized them instantly, Silas's men, led by his foreman, a cruel, ruthless man named Jedediah. They were close, too close. Escape seemed impossible. Jedediah, his eyes cold and merciless, scanned the canyon. "Carter, we know you're in here. Come out now, and maybe we'll spare the woman." Rhett didn't respond. He knew Jedediah's words were empty, that Silas wanted Winnie back at any cost, and that their lives were worth nothing to him. He slowly drew his revolver, the metallic click a chilling sound in the tense silence. Winnie, watching him, felt a surge of both fear and admiration. He was prepared to fight, to defend her, even against overwhelming odds. She knew she should be terrified, but a strange sense of calm settled over her. She trusted him. She trusted him with her life. "Winnie," Rhett whispered, his voice barely audible, "stay down. No matter what happens, stay hidden." She nodded, her eyes meeting his. She saw the determination in his gaze, the unwavering resolve to protect her. She also saw something else, a flicker of vulnerability, a hint of fear that he tried to mask. The standoff continued, the tension thick and suffocating. Jedediah, growing impatient, spurred his horse forward. "Carter, I'm giving you one last chance. Come out now, or we'll burn you out." Rhett remained silent, his eyes fixed on Jedediah, his finger tightening on the trigger. He knew a gunfight was inevitable, that the odds were stacked against him, but he wouldn't surrender. He wouldn't let Silas have Winnie. Suddenly, a shot rang out, the bullet whizzing past Rhett's head, splintering the rock above him. The canyon erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the sound deafening, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Rhett returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. He was a skilled marksman, honed by years of living on the edge of the law. He dropped one of the men, then another, his movements swift and efficient. Winnie, cowering behind the boulder, watched in horror as the battle unfolded. She had never witnessed such violence before, such raw, brutal conflict. The images of her peaceful, predictable life seemed a distant, fading memory. The gunfight raged on, the echoes reverberating through the canyon. Rhett, despite his skill, was outnumbered. He was taking fire from multiple directions, his position becoming increasingly precarious. Jedediah, seeing his opportunity, charged forward, his rifle aimed at Rhett's exposed back. Winnie, seeing the danger, screamed a warning, a primal cry of fear and desperation. Rhett, hearing her scream, spun around, firing just as Jedediah pulled the trigger. The two shots rang out almost simultaneously. Jedediah slumped in his saddle, his body falling lifelessly to the ground. Rhett, however, staggered, clutching his left arm, a crimson stain spreading rapidly across his shirt. He had been hit. Winnie, forgetting her own safety, scrambled out from behind the boulder, rushing to his side. "Rhett, you're hurt." He grimaced in pain, but managed a weak smile. It's just a scratch. I'll be fine." But she could see the pain in his eyes, the way he was struggling to stay upright. The remaining members of Silas's posse, seeing their leader fall, hesitated, their resolve wavering. Rhett, seizing the moment, fired a few more shots, scattering them, forcing them to retreat. They galloped away, leaving behind the bodies of their fallen comrades. Silence descended upon the canyon, a heavy, suffocating silence broken only by Rhett's labored breathing and Winnie's frantic efforts to tend to his wound. She tore strips of cloth from her petticoat, using them to staunch the bleeding, her hands trembling. "We need to get you to safety," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "We need to get you to a doctor." He shook his head, his face pale. No, doctors. They'll ask questions. They'll alert Silas." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "We need to get to the mountains. To my place. It's safe there." She knew he was right. They couldn't risk going to a town, to a doctor. Silas's reach was long, his influence pervasive. They had to rely on themselves, on their own resourcefulness. She helped him back onto his horse, her heart heavy with worry. He was weak, losing blood, and the journey ahead was long and arduous. As they rode, slowly and painfully, towards the distant mountains, Winnie prayed. She prayed for his strength, for his survival, for a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The echoes of the gunfight, of Jedediah and Cruz, faded, but not the image of Rhett, wounded but determined. The haunted past was catching up to both of them. Chapter 6. The Price of Freedom's Flame. The journey to Rhett's mountain sanctuary was a grueling test of endurance. Winnie, despite her own exhaustion and worry, tended to Rhett's wound with a fierce determination, changing the makeshift bandages, rationing their dwindling supplies of water, and keeping a constant vigil for any sign of pursuit. Rhett, weakened by blood loss and fever, drifted in and out of consciousness, his body racked with pain. Winnie pushed herself to the limits of her strength, drawing on reserves she never knew she possessed. She had to be strong for both of them. She had to get him to safety. She had to repay the debt she felt she owed him, the debt for his unwavering protection, for his audacious act of rescuing her from a life she hadn't realized was a gilded cage. As they climbed higher into the mountains, The landscape transformed, the arid desert giving way to pine forests and rocky peaks. The air grew cooler, cleaner, a welcome respite from the scorching heat of the plains. The silence of the mountains, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional cry of a hawk, was both soothing and unsettling. Winnie, despite her exhaustion, found a strange sense of peace in this wild, untamed place. It was a world away from the manicured lawns and stifling social rituals of her former life. It was a place where she could breathe freely, where she could be herself, without the weight of expectation pressing down on her. One evening, as they huddled around a small fire, Rhett, his fever finally broken, looked at her, his eyes clear and lucid. You've saved my life, Winnie," he said, his voice hoarse but sincere. She shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "You saved mine first, Rhett. You gave me a chance at a life I never thought possible." He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes. "You're a strong woman, Winnie. Stronger than you know." His words, spoken with such tenderness, sent a shiver through her. She had never been told she was strong. She had always been the dutiful daughter, the compliant sister, the soon-to-be obedient wife. Strength had been a trait reserved for men, for the ranchers and outlaws who ruled this harsh land. I don't feel strong," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I feel scared, uncertain." He nodded, his eyes understanding. "Fear is natural, Winnie. It's what keeps us alive. But it doesn't have to control us. We can choose to face our fears, to overcome them." His words resonated with a truth she had been slowly discovering. She had faced her fears. She had ridden away from a life of security and into the unknown. She had tended to a wounded outlaw. She had survived the brutal realities of the frontier. She was stronger than she thought. Finally, after days of arduous travel, they reached Rhett's sanctuary, a hidden cabin nestled in a secluded valley, surrounded by towering pines and a crystal-clear stream. It was a simple dwelling, built of rough-hewn logs, but it felt like a haven, a place of refuge from the storms that raged outside. Rhett, still weak but recovering, showed her around, his pride in his home evident in his voice. He had built it himself, he explained, years ago, as a place to escape, to find solace, to heal from the wounds of his past. Winnie, looking around the cabin, felt a sense of awe and gratitude. It was a testament to his resilience, his resourcefulness, his ability to create beauty and order in the midst of chaos. It was a place where they could both heal, where they could both find a measure of peace. As the days passed, Rhett slowly regained his strength, his body mending, his spirit reviving. Winnie tended to him, caring for him with a devotion that surprised even herself. She found a purpose in her actions, a sense of fulfillment in nurturing him back to health. The bond between them deepened, growing stronger with each passing day. They shared stories, they laughed, they argued, they found a companionship that neither of them had expected. The outlaw and the runaway bride, two unlikely souls brought together by fate, were forging a connection that transcended their pasts, their differences, their uncertain future. But even in this secluded sanctuary, the shadows of the outside world lingered. Winnie knew that Silas wouldn't give up, that he would continue to hunt them, that the price of their freedom might be higher than they had anticipated. The flame of their newfound life together was flickering brightly, but it was also vulnerable, threatened by the winds of vengeance and the darkness of the past. One night, while looking at the stars, Winnie brought up the obvious. "He will come for us." Rhett sighed. "I know." Winnie looked over at him, her eyes searching. "What will we do?" Chapter 7. Beneath a Sky of Secrets. Rhett's answer was not immediate. He stared up at the vast, star-studded sky, the Milky Way a shimmering river of light across the inky blackness. The silence of the mountains was profound, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant hoot of an owl. He seemed to be weighing his words carefully, considering the implications of their situation. "We have choices," he finally said, his voice low and thoughtful. "We can run. Keep running. Find a new place, A new life. Somewhere far away from here. Somewhere Silas can't reach us. Winnie considered this option. It was tempting, the idea of escaping, of starting fresh, of leaving behind the baggage of their pasts. But it also felt cowardly. Like they were running away from their problems, instead of facing them. And the other choice? She asked, her voice hesitant. Rhett turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. The firelight flickered in his gaze, revealing a mixture of determination and something else. Something that looked like resignation. We stay, he said, his voice firm. We fight. We defend what we have. We make Silas understand that you're not his to take. That you're free. This option was far more dangerous, far more uncertain. It meant confronting Silas, facing his wrath, risking their lives. But it also felt right. It felt like taking a stand, like refusing to be victims, like claiming their right to choose their own destiny. Winnie felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Fear, yes, but also a sense of exhilaration, a sense of empowerment. She had spent her life being passive, being compliant, letting others make decisions for her. Now she had a choice. She could choose to run, or she could choose to fight. I don't want to run anymore, she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her resolve firm. I'm tired of running. I'm tired of being afraid. Rhett nodded, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. I knew you were strong, Winnie. I knew you had it in you. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. We'll fight together, he said, his voice a promise. We'll face whatever comes, together. His words gave her strength, gave her courage. She squeezed his hand, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she wasn't alone. She had Rhett. And that made all the difference. They spent the next few days preparing, making plans, fortifying the cabin. Rhett, despite his still healing wound, was a whirlwind of activity, gathering supplies, checking his weapons, strengthening the defenses. He was a man transformed, driven by a fierce determination to protect their newfound sanctuary, to protect Winnie. Winnie, in turn, did her part, organizing their supplies, learning how to use a rifle, practicing her aim. She had never been a fighter, but she was determined to learn, to be prepared, to stand by Rhett's side. One afternoon, as they were working together, Rhett stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. Winnie, he said, his voice soft, I need to tell you something. Something about my past. Something about Cruz. She knew this was important, that he was finally ready to share the secrets he had been carrying for so long. She sat down beside him, her heart pounding in her chest. He took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Cruz wasn't just a rival, he began, his voice strained. He was my brother. Winnie gasped, her eyes widening in shock. You're your brother? He nodded, his face etched with pain. My half-brother, actually. We had the same father, different mothers. My father, he favored Cruz. He saw him as his heir, the one who would carry on his legacy. He paused, his voice becoming thick with emotion. I resented him. I hated him. We fought constantly. And then one day we fought over something stupid, something insignificant. It escalated. I lost control. I drew my knife. He touched the scar on his cheek, his fingers trembling. I didn't mean to kill him. But I did. I ran. I became an outlaw. I tried to escape my past, but it followed me. It always follows me. Winnie reached out and gently touched his arm, her heart aching for him. She understood now, the source of his guilt, the weight of his burden. He had been carrying this secret for years, this terrible truth that had shaped his life. It wasn't your fault, Rhett, she said, her voice soft. It was an accident. You were just a boy. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and pain. Thank you, Winnie, for understanding, for not judging me. She smiled, a fragile smile, but a genuine one. I could never judge you, Rhett. Not after all we've been through. Not after all you've done for me. The sharing of his secret had brought them even closer, forging a deeper bond between them. They had both been wounded by their pasts, but they were finding healing in each other's presence, in each other's love. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the valley, they stood together, looking out at the breathtaking view. The sky was ablaze with color, a fiery display of oranges, reds, and purples. It was a beautiful, peaceful scene, but beneath the surface, the tension remained. They knew that Silas was coming. They knew that the storm was about to break. The sky held their secrets, and they his. Chapter 8. Whispers in the Desert Wind. The waiting was the hardest part. Days bled into nights, each sunrise bringing a renewed sense of anticipation, each sunset a reprieve that felt increasingly fragile. The serenity of the mountain sanctuary was tainted by the undercurrent of dread, the knowledge that Silas and his men were out there, somewhere, closing in. Rhett, despite his outward calm, was restless, his senses constantly on alert. He patrolled the perimeter of the cabin, checking for any sign of intrusion, his rifle always within reach. He slept little, his nights punctuated by nightmares, by the echoes of his past. Winnie, too, found sleep elusive. She worried about Rhett, about his still healing wound, about the emotional toll this waiting was taking on him. She worried about their future, about the uncertain outcome of the inevitable confrontation. She tried to keep busy, to distract herself from her fears. She tended to the small garden Rhett had cultivated. She cooked meals from their dwindling supplies. She practiced her shooting, honing her skills with the rifle. She was determined to be ready, to be strong, to be a worthy partner in this fight for their survival. One morning, as she was drawing water from the stream, she noticed something unusual, a faint track in the mud, a sign that someone had been there recently, someone other than Rhett. Her heart skipped a beat. She rushed back to the cabin, her pulse racing. "Rhett," she said, her voice urgent, "I saw something." A track. Near the stream. He was instantly alert, his eyes narrowing. "Show me." They went to the stream together, Rhett examining the track carefully. He knelt down, his fingers tracing the outline of the print. "It's fresh," he said, his voice grim. "Someone was here. Last night, maybe. Scouting us out." Winnie felt a chill run down her spine. The waiting was over. Silas was close. Rhett stood up, his face set with determination. "They're coming," he said, his voice low and steady. "We need to be ready." They returned to the cabin, their movements purposeful, their senses heightened. They checked their weapons, secured the doors and windows, prepared for the inevitable attack. The day passed slowly, agonizingly. The sun beat down mercilessly, the air thick with tension. Winnie found herself jumping at every sound, every rustle of leaves, every cry of a bird. As evening approached, a storm began to gather, the sky darkening, the wind picking up, swirling the dust and leaves into a frenzy. The atmosphere was charged with electricity, a reflection of the tension that crackled between them. They ate a silent meal, their appetites diminished by the impending confrontation. They spoke little, their words unnecessary. They knew what they had to do. They knew the risks. They knew that this might be their last night together. As darkness fell, the storm broke, the rain lashing against the cabin, the wind howling like a banshee. The sound was deafening, masking any other noises, making it impossible to hear if anyone was approaching. Rhett, his face grim, stood by the window, his rifle at the ready. Winnie sat by the fire, her own rifle across her lap, her heart pounding in her chest. Suddenly, a flash of lightning illuminated the landscape, revealing a group of figures approaching the cabin, their faces obscured by the rain and darkness. Silas's men. Rhett raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. "They're here," he said, his voice a low growl. Winnie nodded, her own grip tightening on her rifle. She was terrified, but she was also determined. She wouldn't let Silas take her back. She wouldn't let him destroy the life she had found with Rhett. The first shot rang out, shattering the window, splintering the wood. The battle had begun. The cabin erupted in a cacophony of gunfire, the sound deafening, the air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Rhett returned fire, his shots precise and deadly. Winnie, 2, fired her rifle, aiming at the shadowy figures outside. The storm raged on, the wind and rain adding to the chaos, the lightning illuminating the scene in brief, terrifying flashes. Winnie lost track of time, of the number of men outside, of the progress of the battle. She focused only on surviving, on protecting Rhett, on defending their sanctuary. The wind whispered, but she and Rhett were prepared to roar. Chapter 9. The Heart's Hidden Scars. The gunfight was a brutal, chaotic dance of death. Bullets whizzed through the air, splintering wood, shattering glass, ricocheting off the stone fireplace. Rhett, despite his injured arm, fought with a ferocity born of desperation and a fierce determination to protect Winnie. He moved with a practiced ease, reloading quickly, taking aim with deadly accuracy, his years of living on the edge honed into a lethal skill. Winnie, though less experienced, fought with a courage she didn't know she possessed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a primal instinct to survive, to defend the life she had chosen, the man she had come to love. She fired her rifle, her hands trembling at first, but growing steadier with each shot. She saw one of Silas's men fall, then another, their bodies slumping to the ground. The storm raged outside, mirroring the violence within the cabin. The wind howled, the rain lashed down, the lightning illuminated the scene in brief, terrifying flashes. It was a scene of utter chaos, of desperate struggle, of life and death hanging in the balance. Suddenly, a bullet grazed Rhett's shoulder, spinning him around. He cried out in pain, dropping his rifle, clutching his wounded arm. Winnie, seeing him fall, screamed his name, her heart leaping into her throat. She rushed to his side, firing at the attackers to keep them at bay. "Rhett, are you all right?" she cried, her voice choked with emotion. He grimaced in pain, his face pale.
I'm hit.
But it's not bad. She knew he was lying, trying to reassure her, trying to be strong. But she could see the pain in his eyes, the way he was struggling to stay conscious. She helped him to his feet, supporting his weight, urging him towards the back of the cabin, away from the windows, away from the direct line of fire. "We need to get you out of here," she said, her voice desperate. "We need to find a way to escape." He shook his head, his face set with determination. "No, we can't run. We have to fight. We have to finish this." She knew he was right. Running was no longer an option. Silas would never stop hunting them. They had to make a stand, here and now. She helped him to a chair, propping him up against the wall. She grabbed his rifle, checking the ammunition, her hands surprisingly steady. "I'll cover you," she said, her voice firm. You just rest." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that looked like love. "Winnie," he began, his voice weak. "Don't talk," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Save your strength." She turned back to the window, her rifle at the ready. The attackers were still out there, their numbers dwindling, but their determination unwavering. She fired, her shots finding their mark. She fought with a ferocity she had never known before, fueled by her love for Rhett, by her determination to survive. She had found that hidden part and unearthed all that she could be. The battle raged on, the outcome uncertain. Winnie fought like a woman possessed, her heart pounding, her body aching, her spirit unwavering. She was no longer the timid, compliant woman she had once been. She was a warrior, fighting for her life, fighting for her love, fighting for her freedom. She fought to be worthy of him, of this new life, a life she had no intention of losing. Chapter 10. Where Trust Lies Bleeding. The gunfire outside had lessened, becoming sporadic, less intense. Winnie, her body exhausted, her senses numb, continued to fire, her finger tight on the trigger, her eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. She had lost track of time, of how long the battle had raged, of how many men were left. She heard a groan behind her. Rhett, struggling to sit up, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with pain. "Winnie," he whispered, his voice weak. Are they gone?" She lowered her rifle, her arms trembling with fatigue. She listened intently, straining to hear any sound above the howling wind and the lashing rain. "I think so," she said, her voice hesitant. "I haven't heard anything for a while." But she couldn't be sure. She knew that Silas was cunning, that he wouldn't give up easily. He might be regrouping, planning a new attack. She helped Rhett to his feet, supporting his weight, guiding him towards the door. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to find a safer place." He nodded, his face grim. "The horses are in the shed, behind the cabin." They moved slowly, painfully, towards the back of the cabin, Winnie supporting Rhett, her rifle held at the ready. They reached the door, peering out cautiously into the stormy night. The rain was still falling, but the wind had died down, the storm beginning to abate. The landscape was shrouded in darkness, the only illumination coming from the occasional flash of lightning. They saw no one. No movement. No sign of Silas's men. They slipped out of the cabin, moving stealthily towards the shed, their bodies tense, their senses on high alert. They reached the shed, finding the horses inside, their eyes wide with fear, their bodies trembling. Rhett, with Winnie's help, managed to saddle his stallion, his movements slow and painful. Winnie saddled a smaller mare, her heart pounding in her chest. They mounted their horses, riding out of the shed, into the darkness, leaving behind the shattered cabin, the scene of the bloody battle. They rode slowly, carefully, navigating the treacherous terrain, their destination uncertain. As they rode, Winnie couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that they were being followed. She kept glancing behind her, searching the shadows, her heart filled with a growing sense of unease. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness, stepping in front of them, blocking their path. Winnie gasped, reining in her horse, her hand instinctively reaching for her rifle. It was Samuel, her brother. "Samuel," she cried, her voice a mixture of relief and surprise. What are you doing here?" He looked at her, his face grim, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of emotions. He didn't answer her question. Instead, he raised his own rifle, aiming it directly at Rhett. "I'm sorry, Winnie," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "But I have to do this." Winnie stared at him in disbelief, her mind reeling.
"Samuel, no."
"What are you doing?" "He saved my life." She couldn't finish the sentence, the words catching in her throat. She couldn't believe what was happening, what her own brother was doing. Rhett, too, stared at Samuel, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and understanding. "Silas," he said, his voice weak. He got to you, didn't he?" Samuel nodded, his face still devoid of emotion. "He offered me a deal. The ranch. Free and clear. All debts forgiven. If I brought you back. Both of you." Winnie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. Betrayal. By her own brother. The man she had trusted. The man she had loved. It was a blow more devastating than any bullet. Her heart shattered, the pieces scattering like dust in the wind. Trust lay bleeding, as wounded as Rhett. Chapter 11. A gathering storm of lies. The scene unfolded like a slow, agonizing nightmare. The rain, which had subsided, began to fall again, a soft, steady drizzle that mirrored the tears streaming down Winnie's face. The only other sound was the ragged breathing of the three figures, locked in a tableau of betrayal and despair. "Samuel," Winnie pleaded, her voice cracking, "please. Don't do this. He's hurt. He needs help. We love each other." The word love hung in the air, a fragile, vulnerable thing in the face of Samuel's cold determination. He didn't flinch, his grip on the rifle unwavering. "Love," he scoffed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think this outlaw loves you?
He stole you.
He ruined our family.
He deserves to die."
Rhett, despite his pain and weakness, straightened his posture, his eyes meeting Samuel's with a mixture of defiance and sadness. "You're wrong, Samuel," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "I didn't steal her. She came with me willingly. She chose this life. She chose me." Samuel's gaze flickered for a moment, a flicker of doubt, of uncertainty. But then, his resolve hardened again, his face becoming a mask of cold determination. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice flat. "Silas promised me. He promised me everything. I have to do this. For the ranch. For our family." Winnie felt a surge of anger, a burning rage that replaced her initial shock and despair. "The ranch?" she cried, her voice rising. "You're willing to sacrifice my happiness? My life? For a piece of land? For Silas's promises? He's a liar, Samuel. He'll betray you, just like he betrayed me." Samuel flinched, his eyes wavering. He knew, deep down, that she was right. He knew Silas was a ruthless, manipulative man. But he had made a deal, a pact with the devil, and he couldn't go back. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making. I have no choice," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Rhett, seeing an opportunity, spoke again, his voice calm and persuasive. "Samuel, listen to me. You do have a choice.
You can choose to do what's right.
You can choose to help us. We can find another way. We can fight Silas together." Samuel hesitated, his grip on the rifle loosening slightly. He looked from Rhett to Winnie, his eyes filled with confusion and conflict. He was torn, caught between his loyalty to his family, his desire to save the ranch, and the growing realization that he was making a terrible mistake. The silence stretched, tense and unbearable. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dust, revealing the raw, exposed emotions of the three figures. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, the distant sound of horses approaching. Silas. He was coming. Samuel's eyes widened in panic. He looked at Rhett, then at Winnie, his face a mask of terror. He had run out of time. He had to make a decision. He lowered his rifle, his hand trembling. I can't," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I can't do it." He turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Winnie and Rhett alone, facing the approaching storm. Winnie, her body shaking with relief and residual fear, looked at Rhett. He was pale, weak, his breathing labored. But his eyes were filled with a fierce determination. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent.
Now.
They spurred their horses, galloping away from the approaching riders, towards an uncertain future. The gathering storm of lies had broken, but the true tempest was yet to come. Chapter 12. The Outlaw's Gentle Touch. The desperate flight continued through the night, the rain-soaked landscape a blur of shadows and muted sounds. Rhett, weakened by his wounds and the emotional turmoil of Samuel's betrayal, struggled to stay in the saddle. Winnie, riding beside him, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fierce determination, kept a watchful eye on him, offering words of encouragement, reaching out to steady him whenever he swayed. They rode without speaking, the silence between them filled with unspoken emotions, the shared trauma of the gunfight, the sting of Samuel's betrayal, the uncertainty of their future. The only sounds were the rhythmic beat of the horses' hooves, the splash of water, the occasional groan from Rhett as pain shot through his injured arm and shoulder. As dawn approached, painting the sky in hues of gray and pale pink, they reached a small, secluded canyon, a hidden oasis tucked away amidst the rugged mountains. A narrow stream flowed through the canyon, its banks lined with lush vegetation, a welcome contrast to the harsh, barren landscape they had been traversing. Rhett, his face pale and drawn, slid off his horse, his legs barely able to support his weight. Winnie quickly dismounted, rushing to his side, helping him to the ground. "We'll rest here," she said, her voice filled with concern.
You need to rest.
"And I need to tend to your wounds." He nodded, his eyes closing in exhaustion. She helped him to a sheltered spot beneath a towering rock overhang, spreading out their bedrolls, making him as comfortable as possible. She examined his wounds, her heart sinking at the sight of the inflamed flesh, the signs of infection. She cleaned the wounds carefully, using the last of their clean water and strips of cloth torn from her petticoat. She applied a poultice of herbs she had gathered along the way, herbs Rhett had taught her to identify, herbs that had healing properties. As she worked, she felt a profound sense of tenderness towards him, a deep connection that transcended the circumstances of their flight, the danger that surrounded them. She had come to rely on him, to trust him, to love him. And now, he was relying on her, trusting her with his life. Once she had tended to his wounds, she built a small fire, using the damp which she had gathered, coaxing it to life with painstaking care. She heated water, making a weak tea from the herbs, forcing Rhett to drink it, knowing it would help to fight the infection, to ease his pain. He watched her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something else. Something that made her heart flutter. You're amazing, Winnie, he said, his voice hoarse but sincere. You've saved my life. Again. She smiled, a fragile smile, but a genuine one. We save each other, Rhett. That's what we do. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines of exhaustion etched around her eyes. His touch, despite his rough, calloused hand, was incredibly gentle, sending a shiver of warmth through her. I never thought I'd find someone like you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Someone who saw past the outlaw. Someone who cared. Tears welled up in her eyes, tears of exhaustion, of relief, of love. I never thought I'd find someone like you either, Rhett, she confessed, her voice choked with emotion. Someone who gave me the courage to be myself, to be free. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss of gratitude, of respect, of love. It was a kiss that sealed their bond, that promised a future, however uncertain. They stayed in the secluded canyon for several days, resting, recovering, regaining their strength. Rhett's wounds slowly began to heal, his fever subsided, his strength returned. Winnie tended to him with unwavering devotion, her love for him growing stronger with each passing day. They talked, sharing their hopes and fears, their dreams and regrets. They made plans, tentative plans, for a future they weren't sure they would have. They dreamed of a life together, a life free from fear, free from pursuit, free from the shadows of their pasts. But even in this peaceful sanctuary, they knew that the storm was not over. Silas was still out there, hunting them. And they knew that, sooner or later, they would have to face him. The outlaw's gentle touch had healed her heart, but the world outside remained as harsh as ever. Chapter 13. Crossroads of Fate and Fury. The decision of where to go next weighed heavily on them. Rhett, though recovered from his physical wounds, carried the fresh scar of Samuel's betrayal, a wound that seemed to fester deeper than any bullet could. Winnie, too, felt the sting of her brother's actions, a betrayal that had shattered her trust and left her questioning everything she thought she knew about family and loyalty. They considered their options, each fraught with danger and uncertainty. They could continue to run, to seek refuge in some remote corner of the territory, to live a life of constant fear and hiding. Or they could turn and fight, confront Silas, try to end his reign of terror once and for all. Rhett initially favored the former option. He was tired of running, yes, but he was also fiercely protective of Winnie, unwilling to risk her life in a direct confrontation with Silas. Winnie, however, argued for the latter. She was tired of being a victim, of living in fear. She wanted to reclaim her life, her freedom, her dignity. She wanted to stand up to Silas, to show him that he couldn't control her, that he couldn't break her. We can't keep running, Rhett, she said, her voice firm, her eyes filled with determination. He'll never stop. He'll hunt us to the ends of the earth. We have to face him. We have to end this. Rhett looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw the strength in her gaze, the unwavering resolve. He knew she was right. Running was no longer an option. All right, he said, his voice resigned but resolute. We'll fight, but we'll do it on our terms. We'll choose the time and the place. They decided to head towards redemption, the town where it all began, the town where Silas held sway. It was a dangerous choice, a gamble, but it was also a strategic one. They knew the town, they knew the people, they might be able to find allies, to turn some of Silas's own men against him. They left their secluded canyon, riding slowly, cautiously, towards their uncertain destiny. They knew that the odds were stacked against them, that Silas had the power, the resources, the law on his side. But they also had something that Silas didn't have: the unwavering belief in each other, the unshakable bond of their love. As they rode, they encountered a small group of homesteaders, families struggling to make a living on the harsh land, families who had suffered under Silas's oppressive rule. Rhett, remembering his own father's plight, felt a surge of empathy, a desire to help. He spoke to the homesteaders, listening to their stories, offering them words of encouragement, promising them that he would do everything in his power to help them. He shared some of their meager supplies, offering them what little they could spare. The homesteaders, in turn, offered them their gratitude, their support, their promise of assistance. They knew Rhett's reputation, they knew he was an outlaw, but they also saw his compassion, his genuine desire to help. This encounter strengthened their resolve, reinforced their belief that they were fighting for something more than just their own survival. They were fighting for justice, for freedom, for the right to live without fear. As they approached redemption, they saw the familiar landscape, the dusty streets, the weathered buildings, the small church where their lives had been irrevocably changed. The town seemed quiet, peaceful, but they knew that beneath the surface, tension simmered, fear reigned. They knew that Silas was waiting for them, that he had prepared a trap, that he was ready to crush them. But they were ready too. They were ready to fight, to face their fate, to confront the fury that awaited them. They had reached a crossroads, a point of no return. Their choices, and the rage of others, would determine their fate. Chapter 14. Between Law and Longing. They entered redemption under the cover of dusk, the setting sun casting long, ominous shadows across the dusty streets. The town seemed deserted, the usual hustle and bustle replaced by an eerie silence, a palpable sense of anticipation. Rhett and Winnie rode cautiously, their senses on high alert, their hands hovering near their weapons. They knew Silas wouldn't confront them directly, not yet. He would prefer to use his influence, his connections, to trap them, to turn the town against them. He would use the law, however twisted and corrupt, to his advantage. Their first stop was the saloon, the heart of the town, the place where information flowed as freely as the whiskey. Rhett, his face partially obscured by a wide-brimmed hat and a bandana, entered the saloon, Winnie remaining outside, hidden in the shadows, watching his back. The saloon was dimly lit, smoky, filled with a handful of patrons, their faces grim, their eyes wary. The usual boisterous atmosphere was absent, replaced by a tense silence. Rhett recognized some of the men, Silas's men, their hands resting conspicuously on their holsters. He approached the bar, ordering a whiskey, his voice calm and steady. The bartender, a burly man with a scarred face and a suspicious gaze, served him without a word. Rhett leaned against the bar, casually surveying the room, his eyes taking in every detail, every nuance. He overheard snippets of conversation, whispers about Silas's reward, about the outlaw who had dared to steal his bride, about the impending showdown. He learned that Sheriff Buckley, still under Silas's thumb, had issued a warrant for his arrest, a warrant that authorized deadly force. He learned that Silas had brought in extra men, hired guns, to bolster his forces. He learned that the town was divided, some siding with Silas, some secretly sympathizing with Rhett. He also learned something else, something that sent a chill down his spine. Silas had spread rumors, lies about Winnie, painting her as a wanton woman, a temptress who had seduced him, who had betrayed her family, who deserved to be punished. Rhett felt a surge of anger, a burning rage at Silas's cruelty, at his willingness to slander Winnie's reputation, to destroy her character. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white, his resolve hardening. He finished his whiskey, paid the bartender, and left the saloon, his face a mask of grim determination. He rejoined Winnie, relaying what he had learned. "He's turned the town against us," he said, his voice tight with anger. "He's spread lies about you. He's made this personal." Winnie felt a wave of despair wash over her. She had expected resistance. She had expected violence. But she hadn't expected this deliberate attempt to destroy her reputation, to turn her into a pariah. What do we do? She asked, her voice trembling. Rhett looked at her, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. We fight, he said, his voice unwavering. We fight for the truth. We fight for our honor. We fight for our future. They decided to seek out Sheriff Buckley, to confront him, to try to reason with him, to appeal to his sense of justice, however faint it might be. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but they had to try. They found Buckley in his office, a small, cramped room adjacent to the jail. He was sitting at his desk, his face haggard, his eyes filled with a mixture of weariness and fear. Rhett, his hand resting on his revolver, stood before him, Winnie by his side. Buckley, he said, his voice calm but firm, we need to talk. Buckley looked at them, his gaze shifting from Rhett to Winnie, his expression unreadable. I have nothing to say to you, Carter, he said, his voice flat. You're a wanted man. I have a warrant for your arrest. I know about the warrant, Buckley, Rhett said, his voice unwavering. But I also know that Silas is pulling your strings. He's controlling you. He's using you. Buckley flinched, his eyes wavering. He knew Rhett was right. He was trapped, caught between his duty to uphold the law and his fear of Silas's wrath. Winnie stepped forward, her voice soft but clear. Sheriff, she said, I know you're a good man. I know you believe in justice. Please listen to us. Silas is lying. He's manipulating everyone. He's evil. Buckley looked at her, his eyes filled with a flicker of something. Hope? Regret? He saw the sincerity in her gaze, the desperation in her voice. He saw the truth. He sighed, his shoulders slumping. I don't know what to do, he confessed, his voice barely a whisper.
I'm trapped. He has things on me. He can ruin me.
Rhett and Winnie exchanged a look. They knew they had reached him, that they had broken through his wall of fear. But they also knew that he needed help, that he needed their support. The law was on Silas' side, but longing was now, seemingly, on theirs. Chapter 15. The Dance of Broken Vows. A tense silence filled the sheriff's office, the air thick with unspoken fears and fragile hopes. Buckley, his face etched with conflict, avoided their gaze, his hands trembling slightly. He was a man torn, caught between his duty, his fear, and a glimmer of his former integrity. Rhett, sensing an opportunity, pressed his advantage. Buckley, he said, his voice calm and persuasive, you don't have to be afraid anymore. We can help you. We can expose Silas. We can bring him to justice. But we need your help. Buckley looked up, his eyes meeting Rhett's, a flicker of hope in their depths.
How?
He asked, his voice barely a whisper. He's too powerful. He controls everything. He doesn't control the truth, Winnie said, her voice firm and clear. And the truth is on our side. We have evidence of his crimes, of his corruption. We just need someone to listen, someone to believe us. Buckley hesitated, his mind racing, weighing the risks, considering the consequences. He knew that helping them would be dangerous, that it could cost him everything. But he also knew that it was the right thing to do, that it was his only chance to redeem himself, to reclaim his honor. I have some information, Buckley said, his voice hesitant. About Silas's dealings. About his connections. It's not much, but it might be enough to raise some questions. He explained that Silas had been secretly buying up land from struggling homesteaders, using intimidation and coercion to force them off their property. He had been colluding with corrupt officials, bribing judges, manipulating the law to his advantage. He had even been involved in rustling, stealing cattle from neighboring ranches, including the Hollisters. Winnie gasped, her eyes widening in shock. My family's ranch? She cried, her voice filled with disbelief. He was responsible for our troubles? Buckley nodded, his face grim. He orchestrated it all, Winnie. He wanted your land. He wanted you. Winnie felt a surge of anger, a burning rage that consumed her. She had been a pawn in his game, a victim of his greed and ambition. Her brother had been manipulated, used just like she had. Rhett, his hand resting on Winnie's arm, felt her trembling. He looked at Buckley, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "We need proof, Buckley," he said, his voice hard. "We need evidence that will stand up in court. Can you get it for us?" Buckley hesitated, his fear returning. "It's risky," he said, his voice wavering. "He keeps his records in a safe. In his office. At the ranch." Rhett nodded, his mind racing, formulating a plan. "We'll get it," he said, his voice confident. "We'll break into his office. We'll expose him for what he is." It was a dangerous plan, a reckless gamble, but they had no other choice. They had to fight, to expose Silas's crimes, to clear their names, to reclaim their lives. They left the sheriff's office, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. They knew that the odds were stacked against them, that they were walking into a trap, that they might not survive. But they were ready. They were ready to face Silas, to confront his power, to break the vows he had forced upon Winnie, to reclaim their freedom. As they walked through the town, they saw the faces of the people, their expressions a mixture of fear, suspicion, and hope. They knew that some of them were on their side, that they were rooting for them, that they were praying for their success. They reached the edge of town, preparing to ride towards Silas's ranch, towards the inevitable showdown. The sun was setting, casting a fiery glow across the sky, a backdrop to their dangerous mission. Winnie looked at Rhett, her eyes filled with love and gratitude. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked with emotion. For everything." He smiled, a tender smile, a smile that reached his eyes. "We're in this together, Winnie," he said, his voice soft. "Always." They mounted their horses, riding towards the setting sun, towards their destiny. The dance of broken vows had begun, a dance of danger, of courage, of love, a dance that would determine their fate. Chapter 16. Reckoning at Redemption Ridge. The ride to Silas's ranch, christened Redemption Ridge with an irony that was now painfully obvious, was tense and silent. The vast expanse of the land, usually a source of comfort to Winnie, felt menacing, each shadow seeming to hide a potential threat. Rhett, his senses honed by years of living on the edge, scanned the horizon, his hand never far from his revolver. As they approached the ranch, the sprawling buildings came into view, a testament to Silas's wealth and power. The main house, a grand, imposing structure, stood on a rise overlooking the surrounding land, a symbol of his dominance. Lights flickered in the windows, indicating activity, a sign that Silas was expecting them, that he was prepared. They dismounted a distance from the house, tethering their horses in a secluded grove of trees. They approached on foot, stealthily, using the cover of darkness and the natural contours of the land to conceal their movements. Rhett, taking the lead, outlined his plan. They would enter the house through a back entrance, a small, rarely used door that led to the kitchen. From there, they would make their way to Silas's office, located on the second floor, at the end of a long hallway. It was a risky plan, fraught with danger, but it was their only chance. They reached the back door, Rhett picking the lock with a practiced ease, his movements silent and efficient. They slipped inside, finding themselves in the dimly lit kitchen, the air filled with the lingering scent of cooked food. They moved through the house, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpets, their senses on high alert. They encountered no one, the house seemingly deserted, an eerie silence amplifying the tension. They reached the hallway leading to Silas's office, the long corridor stretching before them, the shadows dancing in the flickering light of the wall sconces. Rhett, his hand on his revolver, took the lead, Winnie following close behind, her own rifle held at the ready. They reached the office door, Rhett listening intently for any sound from within. He heard nothing. He slowly turned the knob, pushing the door open, revealing the dimly lit room. Silas was there. He was standing by the window, his back to them, staring out into the night. He was holding a glass of whiskey, his posture relaxed, seemingly unaware of their presence. Rhett, his revolver aimed at Silas's back, stepped into the room, Winnie following close behind. "Silas," he said, his voice cold and hard. Silas turned, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing in anger. He saw Rhett, he saw Winnie, he saw the revolvers aimed at him. He smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. Well, 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 he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Look what the cat dragged in. The runaway bride and her outlaw lover. I've been expecting you. We're here for the truth, Silas, Rhett said, his voice unwavering. We're here to expose you. We're here to end this. Silas chuckled, a low, throaty sound. The truth? You think you have the truth? I am the truth in this territory. I make the rules. I control everything. Not anymore, Winnie said, her voice firm and clear. We know about your crimes, Silas. We know about the land you stole, the people you hurt, the lies you spread. Silas's smile faded, his eyes hardening. You have nothing, he said, his voice tight with anger. You have no proof. We have Buckley, Rhett said, his voice confident. He's turned against you. He's told us everything. Silas's face turned pale, his composure cracking. He knew he was in trouble, that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. He reached for his own revolver, hidden beneath his coat, his movements swift and desperate. But Rhett was faster. He fired, the shot ringing out in the confined space, the bullet hitting Silas in the shoulder, spinning him around. Silas cried out in pain, dropping his revolver, clutching his wounded arm. He staggered back, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and rage. You won't get away with this, he gasped, his voice weak. I'll see you both hang. Rhett lowered his revolver, his face grim. It's over, Silas, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. You're finished. The reckoning, long awaited, had come to pass, and the ridge, ironically named, saw justice. Chapter 17. Unveiling the Masked Truth. The aftermath of the shooting was a whirlwind of activity. Sheriff Buckley, spurred by his confession and a desire to finally break free from Silas's grip, arrived at the ranch with a contingent of men, not to arrest Rhett and Winnie, but to take Silas into custody. The hired guns, seeing their employer defeated and their paychecks in jeopardy, quickly dispersed, melting back into the shadows from whence they came. Silas, his face contorted with pain and fury, was treated for his wound and then placed under arrest, his protests and threats echoing through the house he had once ruled with an iron fist. The safe in his office was opened, revealing a trove of incriminating documents, deeds, contracts, ledgers, letters, all detailing his illegal activities, his land grabs, his bribery, his coercion. Winnie, watching Silas being led away, felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief that the nightmare was finally over, that she was free from his grasp. Sadness for the wasted years, for the broken trust, for the man she had once thought she might marry, a man who had turned out to be a monster in disguise. Rhett, standing beside her, placed a comforting arm around her shoulders, his touch a source of strength and reassurance. He understood her conflicted emotions. He shared her sense of relief. He knew the pain of betrayal. The next few days were spent sorting through the evidence, working with Sheriff Buckley and a newly appointed, honest judge to unravel Silas's web of deceit. The homesteaders, emboldened by Silas's downfall, came forward, telling their stories, providing further evidence of his crimes. Samuel, who had disappeared after his aborted attempt to betray Rhett and Winnie, was eventually found, hiding in a remote cabin, consumed by guilt and remorse. He confessed his role in Silas's scheme, begging Winnie for forgiveness, a forgiveness she found surprisingly easy to give. She understood the pressure he had been under, the desperation that had driven him to make such a terrible choice. The truth, once masked and hidden, was finally unveiled, brought to light by the courage of Rhett and Winnie, by the belated assistance of Sheriff Buckley, by the collective will of the people who had suffered under Silas's tyranny. Silas was brought to trial, the evidence against him overwhelming. He was found guilty on multiple counts, sentenced to a long prison term, his empire crumbling around him. The land he had stolen was returned to its rightful owners, the debts he had imposed were forgiven, the justice he had perverted was restored. Winnie, cleared of all accusations, her reputation restored, was finally free to live her life on her own terms. She had reclaimed her dignity, her independence, her future. Rhett, too, was exonerated, his past crimes viewed in a new light, his actions seen as a desperate attempt to survive, to fight against injustice. He was no longer an outlaw, a fugitive, but a hero, a man who had risked his life to save the woman he loved, to bring down a corrupt and powerful enemy. The masked truth, hidden for so long, had finally been revealed, bringing with it a sense of closure, a sense of justice, a sense of hope. Redemption Ridge, once a symbol of oppression, had become a symbol of liberation, a testament to the power of courage, of love, of truth. Chapter 18. Blood and Betrayal's Kiss. Despite the legal victory and Silas's imprisonment, a lingering unease settled upon Winnie and Rhett. The wounds inflicted by betrayal, especially from family, ran deep. While Winnie had forgiven Samuel, the ease with which he'd been swayed by Silas's promises left a scar on her heart. Rhett, too, struggled with the echoes of his past, the knowledge that his own brother had been his enemy, a shadow that stretched even into the present. One cool evening, as they sat on the porch of the small cabin they now shared, a modest dwelling compared to Silas's mansion, but infinitely richer in peace and genuine affection, Winnie broached the subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Rhett," she began, her voice soft but hesitant, "do you ever think about your brother? About Cruz?" Rhett, who had been gazing out at the star-filled sky, turned to her, his expression clouded with a mixture of sadness and regret. He rarely spoke of Cruz, the pain of that loss, the guilt of his own hand in it, still a raw wound. Sometimes he admitted, his voice low, It's hard to forget. He was my brother even though we fought. Even though he trailed off, unable to voice the full extent of their fractured relationship. Winnie reached out and took his hand, her touch a silent offering of comfort and understanding. "It wasn't your fault, Rhett," she said, her voice firm.
"You told me."
"It was an accident. You were young, both of you." He squeezed her hand, his gratitude evident in his eyes. "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it's hard to forgive myself. It's hard to move on." "You have moved on, Rhett," Winnie insisted. "You're a different man now. You're a good man. You've proven that time and again." He smiled, a wan smile, but a genuine one. "Thanks to you, Winnie," he said, his voice soft. "You helped me find my way back. You gave me something to live for." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden noise, the sound of approaching horses, multiple horses, riding hard. Rhett, instantly alert, stood up, his hand moving to his revolver. "Stay here," he said, his voice urgent. "I'll see who it is." Winnie, her heart pounding with apprehension, watched as he moved towards the edge of the porch, his body tense, his senses on high alert. She had a terrible feeling, a premonition of danger. The riders appeared, their faces obscured by the darkness, their intentions unclear. But as they drew closer, Winnie recognized one of them, a tall, lean figure with a distinctive scar on his left cheek.
"It couldn't be."
"It was impossible." "Gruf?" she whispered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and horror. The riders reined in their horses, the figure dismounting, stepping into the light cast by the porch lamp. It was Cruz.
Alive.
And his eyes, filled with a cold, calculating hatred, were fixed on Rhett. "Hello, brother," Cruz said, his voice dripping with venom. "Surprised to see me?" Rhett stared at him, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. "You're alive?" he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Cruz chuckled, a cruel, mocking sound. "Did you really think you could kill me, Rhett? Did you really think you could get away with it?" He revealed that the knife fight so long ago hadn't ended the way Rhett had believed all this time. Silas had found Cruz, nursed him back, and recruited Cruz. "I have been waiting for a long, long time." The kiss of betrayal, thought long buried, had returned, stained with blood and vengeance. Chapter 19. The Silent Promise of Dawn. The confrontation on the porch was a whirlwind of raw emotion and shattered illusions. Cruz, fueled by years of resentment and a thirst for revenge, revealed the twisted truth of his survival. Silas, in a final act of manipulation, had found Cruz wounded but alive after the fight, nursed him back to health, and used him as a pawn in his long game of vengeance against Rhett. Rhett, reeling from the shock of seeing his supposedly dead brother, struggled to comprehend the depth of the deception. He had lived with the guilt of Cruz's death for years, a burden that had shaped his life, his choices, his very identity. Now, that burden was lifted, only to be replaced by a new, more terrifying reality: a brother who was his sworn enemy. Winnie, watching the scene unfold, felt a surge of fear and protectiveness. She saw the pain in Rhett's eyes, the confusion, the betrayal. She also saw the cold, calculating hatred in Cruz's gaze, the threat he posed to everything she and Rhett had built together. "You lied," Rhett said, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "You let me believe you were dead. You let me suffer." Cruz shrugged, his expression indifferent. "It served my purpose," he said, his voice cold. "It made you weak. It made you vulnerable. And now I'm here to finish what you started." He drew his revolver, his hand steady, his aim true. Rhett, still reeling from the shock, was slow to react. Winnie, seeing the danger, acted instinctively. She grabbed her own rifle, which she had kept close, and fired, the shot ringing out in the night, hitting Cruz in the arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. Cruz cried out in pain, clutching his wounded arm, his eyes filled with rage. He glared at Winnie, his hatred palpable. You bitch," he snarled. "You'll pay for that." Rhett, finally snapping out of his shock, drew his own revolver, aiming it at Cruz. "Don't you touch her," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Don't you ever threaten her again." The men Cruz had arrived with, mercenaries and thugs loyal to Silas, hesitated, uncertain what to do. Their leader was wounded, their plan disrupted. Rhett, seizing the opportunity, addressed them directly. "Silas is in prison," he said, his voice loud and clear. "He's finished. You have no reason to fight for him. Leave now, and you'll be spared." The men, seeing the truth in his words, seeing the determination in his eyes, made their decision. They turned and rode away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Cruz alone, wounded and defeated. Rhett kept his revolver aimed at Cruz, his finger tight on the trigger. He could kill him, and this threat once and for all. But he hesitated. He looked at Cruz, his brother, his enemy, and saw not just hatred, but also pain, a reflection of his own tortured past. "Why, Cruz?" he asked, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. "Why did you do this? Why did you become like him?" Cruz laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Because he understood me," he said, his voice weak. "He saw my potential. He gave me purpose." "A false purpose," Rhett said, his voice firm. "A purpose built on lies and hatred. You chose the wrong path, Cruz." He lowered his revolver, his hand trembling. He couldn't kill him. He couldn't kill his own brother, even after everything. "Get out of here, Cruz," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Leave and never come back. If I ever see you again, I won't hesitate." Cruz, his face contorted with pain and defeat, struggled to his feet. He looked at Rhett, his eyes filled with a mixture of hatred and something else. Something that looked like regret. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness, leaving Rhett and Winnie alone, standing on the porch, the silence broken only by the sound of their ragged breathing. Winnie, her body shaking with relief and residual fear, rushed to Rhett's side, embracing him tightly. "It's over," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "It's finally over." Rhett held her close, his arms wrapped around her, his face buried in her hair. He didn't speak, his silence filled with a profound sense of peace. The storm had passed. The dawn was approaching, a silent promise of a new beginning, a new life, a new hope, hung in the air, unspoken but deeply felt. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts and horizons. The days following Cruz's departure were filled with a quiet intensity, a sense of rebuilding and reflection. Rhett, though relieved that his brother was alive, grappled with the reality of their fractured relationship, the knowledge that their paths had diverged so irrevocably. Winnie, her strength unwavering, offered him comfort and support, her love a constant source of solace in the aftermath of the emotional turmoil. They decided to leave the small cabin, the scene of so much conflict, and return to Winnie's family ranch, the land that had been at the heart of so much strife. The ranch, now free from Silas's clutches, felt different, lighter, the air filled with a sense of possibility, of a new beginning. Samuel, humbled and remorseful, worked tirelessly to repair the damage he had caused, to earn back Winnie's trust, to rebuild his relationship with his sister. He had a long way to go, but Winnie, her heart filled with a newfound understanding of human frailty and the power of forgiveness, welcomed him back, offering him a second chance. Rhett, too, found a sense of purpose in working the land, in helping to restore the ranch to its former glory. He was no longer an outlaw, a fugitive, but a rancher, a partner, a man with a future. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set over the vast expanse of the Arizona landscape, Winnie turned to Rhett, her eyes filled with a question that had been lingering in her heart. "Rhett," she began, her voice soft but hesitant. What about us? What about our future?" He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that was both fierce and tender. He had been asking himself the same question, wondering if he deserved a future with her, if he could truly leave his past behind. I want a future with you, Winnie," he said, his voice sincere. "More than anything. But I understand if you have doubts. If you can't forget who I was." She smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile. "I have no doubts, Rhett," she said, her voice firm. "I love you. Not who you were, but who you are. Who you've always been, deep down. A good man, a strong man, a man who deserves happiness." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers, their touch a symbol of their unbreakable bond. "And you, Winnie," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You deserve the world. You deserve a life filled with love, with joy, with peace." He paused, then continued, his voice filled with a newfound conviction. "I want to marry you, Winnie," he said, his voice clear and strong. Not in a forced ceremony, not in a desperate attempt to save a ranch, but in a true union, a union of hearts, a union of souls. Tears welled up in Winnie's eyes, tears of joy, of gratitude, of love. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Yes, Rhett. I'll marry you." They embraced, their bodies melting together, their hearts beating as one. The final confrontation, the confrontation of their pasts, their fears, their doubts, had led them to this moment, a moment of perfect clarity, of perfect love, of perfect union. The wedding, when it finally happened, was a small, intimate affair held under the vast, open sky, surrounded by the beauty of the Arizona landscape. They invited only their closest friends, the homesteaders who had supported them, Sheriff Buckley, who had redeemed himself, and Samuel, who stood by Winnie's side, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and regret. Winnie wore a simple dress, made of white linen, adorned with wildflowers. Rhett wore a clean shirt and trousers, his usual outlaw attire replaced by clothes that reflected his new life, his new beginning. They exchanged vows, simple vows, heartfelt vows, vows that spoke of love, of loyalty, of commitment. They promised to be there for each other, through thick and thin, through joy and sorrow, through whatever life might bring. As they stood there, hand in hand, husband and wife, they looked out at the horizon, at the vast expanse of the future that stretched before them. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the land, a symbol of hope, of promise, of a new dawn. The final confrontation had been won, not with guns or violence, but with love and forgiveness, with courage and truth. The hearts and horizons, once filled with shadows and uncertainty, were now filled with light and with love. Epilogue. Years passed, flowing as gently as the stream that meandered through the Hollister Ranch. Winnie and Rhett, their love a constant flame against the backdrop of the ever-changing Arizona sky, built a life together, a life filled with the simple joys of hard work, shared laughter, and quiet companionship. The ranch thrived, a testament to their combined efforts, a symbol of their resilience and their commitment to each other. Samuel, his past mistakes a constant reminder of the fragility of trust, became a steady and reliable partner, his loyalty to Winnie and Rhett unwavering. Children came, not of their own blood, but adopted from among the families of the homesteaders who had stood by them during their darkest hours. They raised them with love and care, instilling in them the values of honesty, integrity, and compassion, the values that had guided them through their own trials. Rhett, though he never fully escaped the shadow of his past, found a measure of peace in his new life, in his role as husband, father, and rancher. He learned to forgive himself, to accept his past, to embrace the future. He became a respected member of the community, a man known for his fairness, his generosity, and his quiet strength. Winnie, her spirit as vibrant as the Arizona sunsets, blossomed in her new life. She found a fulfillment she had never known before, a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. She was no longer the unwilling bride, the woman trapped by circumstance, but a woman who had chosen her own destiny, a woman who had found love and happiness in the most unexpected of places. They often sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun set, their hands intertwined, their hearts filled with gratitude. They had weathered the storms, they had faced their demons, they had emerged stronger, their love a beacon of hope in a world that often seemed harsh and unforgiving. One evening, as the sky blazed with a fiery display of colors, Winnie looked at Rhett, her eyes filled with a love that had deepened with time. "We did it, Rhett," she said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "We found our way." He smiled, a tender smile, a smile that reached his eyes. "We did it together, Winnie," he said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "We always will." And as the stars began to appear, twinkling in the vast expanse of the night sky, they sat there, together, their love a silent testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a testament to the possibility of redemption, of forgiveness, of a new dawn, even after the darkest of nights. The story of their stolen beginning had faded, and in its place remained a beautiful, complex, and enduring love.